They laughed when a widow with 3 daughters bought a dry, dead farm. No one believed she'd last a month, but what she built left the whole town speechless. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you're watching from. The morning began like any other, though something in the air already felt wrong. The light was thin and slow, creeping across the cracked floorboards, catching on the dust that drifted through the kitchen window. Raina stood barefoot by the sink, her hands deep in cold water, watching the horizon beyond the pastures. The sun had barely risen, but she could already see movement on the dirt road, a shape, a line of vehicles stirring up clouds of dust. For a moment, she thought it was another neighbor hauling hay or cattle feed. Then she saw the county seal printed on the sides of the trucks. Her stomach tightened before her mind caught up with what her eyes already knew. She had been waiting for this without admitting it. The letters had come weeks ago, one after another, stamped, official, impossible to ignore. She had tried to reason with the men at the courthouse, even drove to the city once, with her youngest asleep on the passenger seat and the other 2 in the back, clutching sandwiches she had packed at dawn. The clerk there had spoken kindly but firmly, using words that meant nothing and everything at once. Eminent domain, reassignment, administrative correction. They all translated to the same truth. The land her husband had worked, the land he had promised would always be theirs, no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the state. Now, standing in the kitchen with her hair still damp from washing, she could hear the engines grow louder. The girls were awake, small feet padding down the hall, soft voices asking if breakfast was ready. She told them yes, though her voice came out thinner than she meant it to. When she stepped outside, the wind met her face, dry and sharp. The trucks were there, 4 of them, and a man in a beige suit was getting out, unfolding a clipboard like a priest opening scripture. Raina didn't shout. There was no strength left for that. She stood with her arms crossed, watching strangers walk her fences, measuring what they called boundaries, but what to her were memories. Her husband had built those fences himself, post by post. He had died before finishing the South Line. He had believed that work and faith were protection enough against the world. He had been wrong. Now the world was collecting its debt. By noon, they had placed a metal sign at the entrance, property of the state of Oklahoma, no trespassing. And one of the workers, a young man who wouldn't meet her eyes, mumbled that she had 48 hours to vacate. She nodded once, not trusting herself to speak. The youngest girl, June, asked what the sign meant. Raina lifted her into her arms and said only, "It means we're moving." That night, after the girls had fallen asleep on the living room floor, she sat at the table with a candle and went through what little they owned. A few photographs, her husband's toolbox, 3 blankets, some jars of canned beans and peaches. She stared at the dark window, where her reflection looked older than she felt. The silence in the house was different now, not the quiet of peace, but the hush that comes before departure. She wanted to cry, but even that seemed wasteful. The next morning the neighbors came, some out of curiosity, others with baskets of food or polite sympathy. Tom, who had farmed the next property for 30 years, shook his head and told her she ought to leave while she could. "The government doesn't give back what it takes," he said. His wife, Sandy, gave the girls a bag of apples and whispered that they'd be happier in town. When they drove away, Raina could hear laughter from the open window of their truck. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. The laughter of people who had decided she was already defeated. By evening, she had made up her mind. She would not go far. The thought of leaving the only horizon she knew made her chest ache. Somewhere nearby, there had to be a piece of land still willing to hold her. She packed the essentials into the old pickup, a sack of flour, some clothes, the hens in a crate tied with rope. The engine coughed to life, reluctant but obedient. The three girls sat close together on the seat, their faces pressed to the window as the house grew smaller behind them. Raina didn't look back. She had said her goodbye the night before, walking through every room, touching the walls one last time, like she was tracing the outline of a memory she couldn't keep. The road north was empty. Miles of brown fields stretched on either side, broken only by the silhouettes of barns and windmills long abandoned. After an hour, she saw it, a narrow lane leading to a property that looked forgotten by everyone except the wind. The real estate sign leaned sideways in the weeds. The house beyond it was little more than a skeleton of wood and rusted tin, and beside it stood an enormous metal structure, a disused repair hangar with doors so tall it looked like it had once swallowed whole tractors. The well was capped, the soil cracked, but the price was so low it felt like a dare. She bought it the next day, signing the papers with hands still shaking from exhaustion. The first night there, the girls refused to sleep alone. The house smelled of dust and mice. The roof leaked in 2 places. Raina made a fire in the stove and watched the flames crawl up the dry wood, throwing shadows across the walls. June clutched her arm, asking if this was home now. "Yes," Raina said softly. "For as long as we can make it one." The next weeks passed in a blur of labor and fatigue. She repaired the porch, patched the roof with tin, cleaned the hangar of debris. The place had been a machine workshop once. She found tools, old nails, even an engine block under a tarp. The land around it seemed lifeless, a pale crust of dirt that turned to dust at the touch of a boot. But she remembered what her husband used to say. The earth only forgets when people stop talking to it. So she spoke to it again, through work. She dug, watered, turned the soil. She let the girls scatter seeds and helped them chase the hens back into their crate when they wandered too far. Every evening she fell asleep, too tired to think. Then came the first rain, a thin drizzle that barely wet the ground, but to Raina it felt like a blessing. She stood outside in it, face lifted, eyes closed, until the girls laughed and ran to join her. They danced barefoot in the mud, and she realized that for the first time since the trucks had come, she was smiling. Yet the town didn't forget her. At the feed store, people still whispered. "She's trying to farm that dead patch by Miller's old property," one man said. "Doesn't know when to quit." Another added, "Her husband had the sense. She's just stubborn." She pretended not to hear. Let them think what they wanted. Pride had no use in survival. At night, she would write lists of what needed fixing: the pump, the gutter, the stove. Each morning she crossed off at least one thing. The girls learned to help. Ellie, the eldest, swept the porch and fetched water. Laura gathered firewood. June, too small for real work, followed her mother everywhere, carrying a tin pail just for the feeling of being useful. Slowly, the farm began to change. The field behind the house softened under the shovel. Weeds were replaced by small rows of green. The air smelled different, less of rust, more of life trying again. But progress didn't stop the loneliness. Some nights, Raina would step outside and look at the distant lights of her old town flickering beyond the hills. She wondered if anyone there thought of her at all. She wondered what her husband would have said, seeing her here, alone, but still standing. The thought steadied her more than it hurt. She went back inside, kissed each sleeping child, and whispered a promise that they would never again be at the mercy of anyone's signature. When spring finally came, the land began to show its first true color. A strip of green across the brown, thin as a breath, but alive. Raina watched it grow with the same quiet awe she once had for her children taking their first steps. The earth had not abandoned her after all. It had only been waiting for someone stubborn enough to try again. One afternoon, as she stood near the well she'd cleared herself, she heard a car slowing down on the road. A familiar voice called her name, Tom, the neighbor who had laughed months ago. He leaned out of his truck window and said almost grudgingly, "Didn't think you'd make it this far." She only smiled. "Neither did I," she said. When he drove off, she felt no bitterness. The proof of her survival didn't need witnesses. The days grew warmer, and with them came a sense of rhythm. Morning chores, afternoon repairs, evenings spent reading to the girls by lantern light. The roof still leaked in heavy rain. The chickens still escaped through gaps in the fence. But Raina no longer felt lost. The farm, for all its flaws, was beginning to breathe with her. And though she didn't know it yet, that patch of earth, the one everyone had called hopeless, was about to change more than just her own life. The next season would bring drought, a new friendship, and a quiet recognition from a man who'd once thought strength only belonged to those who never lost anything. But for now, under the soft hum of the wind and the smell of fresh soil, Raina finally believed that what had been taken from her was not the end, only the beginning. Spring arrived with no promise. The wind still carried the chill of winter, and the fields surrounding Raina's small house looked as dry and gray as ash. Yet something inside her had changed. The fear that once pressed against her ribs had quieted into something else. A slow, steady defiance. Each morning she rose before dawn, wrapped in her husband's old jacket, and stepped outside to face the land that others had already pronounced dead. The air smelled faintly of dust and iron. It clung to her skin, filled her lungs, but she no longer recoiled from it. She had decided that the only way to heal was to dig. She began with her hands. The soil was hard, brittle, unyielding, but she forced the shovel down again and again until blisters opened on her palms. Her eldest, Ellie, followed her without complaint, lugging buckets of water from the well. Laura carried seeds in a tin box, counting them out carefully as though they were coins. Little June toddled behind them with a wooden pail too large for her arms, determined to help. Together, they made rows, crooked, uneven, but theirs. The first day they planted beans, onions, and a handful of corn kernels Raina had found in a jar left behind by the previous owner. It was almost nothing, but it was a beginning. At night, when the girls were asleep, Raina would sit by the window, staring at the field barely visible under moonlight. She would remember her husband's words, the ones she had dismissed when life still felt safe. "The earth listens if you speak to it kindly," he had said once, half joking. She whispered now, not in prayer, but in quiet determination. "I'm still here," she told the land. "I haven't given up." Days turned into weeks. The sun grew harsher, and her muscles ached in ways she didn't know possible. The calluses on her palms thickened. The blisters hardened into proof that she was learning the land's language. Sometimes she wanted to stop, to let the soil win, but every time she looked at her daughters playing by the fence, she found another ounce of strength. They had lost their father, their home, and the world's belief in them. She couldn't let them lose hope, too. The neighbors still watched. From passing trucks and store windows, from across church parking lots, they glanced toward the road that led to her property. Some laughed openly. "That ground's cursed," they said. "It won't grow a thing." Others offered sympathy that felt like condescension. "She's trying her best," they murmured, as if effort were a quaint but hopeless act. Raina heard them, but their voices began to blur into the wind. She had learned that people rarely change their opinions until they see something bloom in front of them. Then one morning, after a week of relentless heat, she saw it. A line of green breaking through the brown. tiny, trembling shoots pushing upward, impossibly alive. Her breath caught. She fell to her knees and brushed the soil aside gently, almost afraid to touch them. When Ellie came running, she pointed wordlessly, tears glinting in her eyes. "See," she whispered, "the earth remembers." It became a ritual every morning, walking the rows, checking each sprout, whispering thanks. The farm began to take shape, piece by piece. The old hangar she once feared became a sanctuary. She cleared it out, scrubbed the floors, patched the holes in the roof. The smell of rust gave way to the scent of oil and wood. She hung tools on the walls and built shelves from scrap lumber. It was no longer a ruin, but a workshop her husband would have approved. As the days lengthened, Raina found herself thinking less of loss and more of rhythm. Work began before sunrise. Rest came after sunset. Her body learned when to bend, when to lift, when to stop. Her daughters learned too how to plant straight rows, how to collect eggs, how to chase the hens out of the corn. There were moments of laughter, moments of exhaustion, but beneath it all was a growing sense of belonging. The land was no longer an enemy. It was a partner, stubborn and silent, but alive. Still, there were nights when doubt crept back in. The money was running low. The generator sputtered more often than it worked. Sometimes she caught her reflection in the window and didn't recognize the woman staring back. The city lights in the distance flickered like a memory of another life, a life with safety, with warmth, with someone else's shoulder to lean on. But she reminded herself that what she had now, she had earned with her own hands. No one could take that away. By early summer, the neighbors' laughter had quieted. People began stopping by under harmless pretenses, to borrow a tool, to ask about her hens, to see the field that had somehow turned green. Even Tom, who had once told her to sell and leave, came by in his truck. He leaned against the fence, chewing a toothpick, and asked what kind of seed she'd used. "The same kind everyone else buys," she said. He nodded, not quite meeting her eyes. After that, he started bringing her spare parts, bolts, and pieces of pipe from his shed. He didn't call it help, and she didn't thank him out loud. That was how people here said they respected you. Then, one hot afternoon, Raina met the woman who would change everything. She was sitting on the porch, mending a torn glove, when a soft voice called from the gate. A slender elderly woman stood there, wearing a wide hat and carrying a jar of preserves. Her name was Mabel. She lived down the road, on a small property shaded by pecan trees. "I heard there's someone brave enough to farm Miller's old land," she said with a smile. Raina laughed, surprised at her own ease. "Brave or foolish, I'm still deciding." Mabel started visiting regularly after that. Sometimes she brought seeds, sometimes old books about gardening, sometimes nothing but stories. She talked about her late husband, who had been a teacher, and about her own attempts at keeping a garden after he passed. Her voice was calm, unhurried, and filled with the kind of wisdom that didn't need to prove itself. Raina found herself looking forward to those visits. They would sit on the porch drinking coffee, watching the wind ripple across the field, saying little. There was comfort in silence shared between women who had both known loss but refused to let it define them. The friendship grew in small gestures. When Mabel's old fence fell, Raina helped repair it. When Raina's roof started leaking, Mabel showed up with a tarp and nails before Raina could ask. They didn't talk about loneliness, but it was there, an unspoken thread that connected them more deeply than words ever could. Even the girls adored her, running to greet her whenever her car appeared on the road. For the first time in a long while, Raina's life began to feel less like survival and more like living. But the land wasn't done testing her. By late summer, the rain stopped coming. The sky turned pale and empty, and the heat became a weight, pressing down on everything. The ground hardened again, splitting in long cracks. Leaves curled inward, brittle and gray. The well's water level dropped so low she could see the dry stones at the bottom. Every day she carried buckets farther and farther from the creek, and every night she returned exhausted, her arms trembling. The neighbors shook their heads. She got lucky once, they said. It won't last. Rayna refused to listen. She spent a whole evening inside the hangar, rummaging through the junk she had stored there. Rusted pipes, old barrels, bits of sheet metal, useless to most, but not to her. She began building a system to collect what little rain might still come. The next days were a blur of hammering and lifting, fitting gutters to the roof, connecting pipes to barrels. The girls helped, even little June, who carried bolts in her pockets like treasures. When the sky finally opened weeks later, the sound of rain on tin was like music. The barrels filled one after another, overflowing with muddy, precious water. Rayna stood in it, soaked, laughing through tears she hadn't realized were falling. The girls danced beside her, shouting with joy, and even Mabel came running down the road with her hat clutched to her head, laughing until she was breathless. The drought broke, and the land responded. Within days, new shoots pushed through the soil. The corn rose again. The beans stretched toward the sun. Rayna watched it all in quiet wonder. She had fought for every inch of this place, and now it was fighting with her. By autumn, the fields shimmered with gold and green. The harvest was small, but real: baskets of beans, sacks of corn, rows of onions hanging from the rafters to dry. Rayna loaded what she didn't need into the pickup and drove to the market. People stopped her there, curious and kind. "You made that old place live again," they said. "Didn't think it was possible." She smiled and said only that the land had been waiting for someone patient enough to listen. A few weeks later, her name appeared in the local newspaper. Just a short article, tucked near the back. "Widowed mother revives abandoned farm." There was a picture, too, her standing beside her daughters, their faces shy but proud. She cut it out and pinned it to the wall by the kitchen, not for vanity, but as proof that hope could grow from ruin. That winter, when the last of the leaves fell and the nights grew long, Rayna sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the smoke rise from the chimney. Mabel sat beside her, knitting something for the girls. The two women spoke little. They didn't need to. The world around them had gone quiet, resting after months of struggle. The fields were bare again, but Rayna no longer saw emptiness there. She saw promise, a promise she had earned with sweat and persistence. And far away, beyond the hills, in a city filled with glass buildings and busy people who never looked up from their phones, Mabel's son was finishing another long week at his law firm, unaware that his next visit home would change not only his mother's life, but Rayna's too. For now, though, all was still. The earth slept, waiting for spring, and Rayna sat listening to the wind hum softly through the broken boards of the porch, certain for the first time that she had built something no one could take from her again. The frost came early that year, dusting the fields in silver and quieting the earth that had given all it could through the long summer. Rayna rose before sunrise as always, wrapping her coat tighter around her shoulders before stepping out onto the porch. The boards creaked under her boots, the air crisp enough to sting her lungs. Beyond the fence, the land lay still, its colors muted beneath the pale dawn. The fields that had once seemed lifeless were now resting, waiting, much like she was. The harvest was done, the stores full, and the house, though still small and patched together, felt steady. She could finally breathe without fear of what tomorrow might take away. Mabel's visits had become part of the rhythm of her days. The old woman would walk the narrow road between their homes, her figure small but sure against the wide sky, a basket of bread or dried apples swinging from her arm. Sometimes she came simply to sit by the fire and talk about small things. The weather, the girls, the way the world seemed slower now that she had someone to share it with. Raina found herself listening more than speaking, grateful for the warmth of another presence in a life that had long been ruled by silence. It was on one of those mornings, when the sky was low and the wind sharp, that Raina first saw the unfamiliar car approaching down the dirt road. It was too clean, too polished to belong to anyone from the valley. The tires crunched to a stop in front of Mabel's house, and a tall man stepped out, closing the door with the deliberate care of someone used to order. His coat was dark, his shoes shone even through the dust, and though Raina couldn't see his face from where she stood, she could tell by his movements that he was out of place here. Mabel had mentioned her son once or twice, a lawyer in the city, busy and successful, who called more often than he visited. Now he was here. The girls ran along the fence, curious. "Who's that, Mama?" Ellie asked, squinting against the glare. Raina told them to come inside, though she herself stayed on the porch for a moment longer, watching as the man disappeared into Mabel's doorway. There was something unsettling about seeing the city intrude on their quiet world, even if it came in the form of family. She turned back to her chores, pushing the thought aside. For the next few days, Raina saw the man often. He came and went between the house and the small town nearby, his car leaving straight lines of tracks across the dirt road. Mabel seemed pleased, but tired after each visit. "He means well," she told Raina, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "He thinks I should sell this place, move closer to him. Says I'm too old to live out here alone." Raina poured her another cup of tea and said softly, "Maybe he just worries." Mabel nodded. "Maybe. But he doesn't understand. This land isn't loneliness to me. It's the last piece of life that still feels honest." The man's name was Daniel. He finally introduced himself to Raina one afternoon when he caught her repairing a section of fence near the road. His handshake was polite, his smile practiced, but not insincere. "My mother talks about you," he said. "I thought I should meet the woman who's managed to make the impossible grow." Raina brushed dirt from her hands, uneasy under his sharp gaze. "It's just work," she replied. "The land gives back what you put in." He nodded, but she could tell he didn't truly understand. People who lived surrounded by concrete rarely did. Still, Daniel lingered. Though he said he was staying only a few days, he seemed reluctant to leave. He took long walks around the fields, sometimes stopping by Raina's fence to watch the girls play or to ask questions about her crops. He wasn't intrusive, but he had the air of someone observing a world foreign to him, trying to reconcile it with everything he thought he knew. Once, Raina caught him standing by the hangar, running his hand along the metal siding, as if tracing the marks of its history. When she asked if he needed anything, he simply said, "I didn't think it would feel this alive out here." There was something honest in his tone that softened her opinion of him. A week later, trouble arrived again, not in the form of laughter or gossip this time, but in a government truck. A man stepped out wearing a jacket with the county seal. He was there, he said, to inspect the property boundaries. Someone had reported unauthorized construction, an old building being repurposed without documentation. He gestured toward the hangar with a clipboard. Raina felt the familiar chill of fear crawl up her spine. Not again, she thought. Not this time. Daniel happened to be there that afternoon, standing by his mother's fence when he noticed the truck. He walked over as the official began asking Raina for permits, deeds, verification. She held her ground, her voice calm but firm, explaining that she had done nothing illegal. Still, the man spoke to her as though she were ignorant, as though she didn't understand her own rights. Daniel stepped closer then, his tone polite, but edged with authority. "You'll find her documentation is in order," he said. "May I see your warrant for inspection?" The official hesitated, caught off guard. Raina watched in silence as Daniel handled the exchange with practiced ease. Within minutes, the man muttered something about a misunderstanding and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. When it was over, Daniel turned to Raina, his expression softer. "You did all this yourself," he said quietly. "Every paper, every boundary line. You learned it on your own." She nodded, unsure whether it was pride or exhaustion that made her throat tighten. "No one else was going to do it for me," she said. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the dry grass. Then he said, almost to himself, "My clients in the city fight over what they never built. You're fighting to protect what you made with your hands." I'd forgotten there was a difference. After that day, Daniel visited often, though he never overstayed. He helped Mabel stack firewood, repaired a broken step on her porch, and once spent an entire afternoon helping Raina mend the roof of the chicken coop. The girls liked him, though they kept their distance at first, unsure of this tall, quiet man who seemed both strong and sad. When June tripped one day and scraped her knee, it was Daniel who lifted her, who found the clean cloth and tied it carefully. Raina watched from a distance, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. Not affection, not attraction, but a kind of respect that was deeper than either. One evening, as the sky turned the color of rust and lavender, Mabel invited them both for supper. The small kitchen was filled with the smell of cornbread and stew. The girls sat laughing at one end of the table, while Mabel and Daniel talked softly about the city, about noise and glass and deadlines. Raina listened, half lost in thought, until Mabel said something that made her look up. "Daniel," she said, "you spend your life fighting for what the law says is right. But there's another kind of right, the one you feel in your bones. Don't let the first blind you to the second." Daniel met his mother's eyes, then turned toward Raina. "I think I'm starting to see the difference," he said. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. The conversation drifted elsewhere, but the words lingered in the air long after the plates were cleared. Before he left for the city, Daniel came by the farm one last time. The morning was bright but cold, the fields still asleep under the frost. He carried a folder in his hand. "I went through the county office," he told her. "Your property deed was never finalized after the land transfer. It's vulnerable to claim disputes. I fixed that." He handed her the folder. Inside were the official papers, sealed and signed. Her name, her full name, was written across the top. The land was hers, legally and permanently. She looked up, unable to speak. He smiled faintly. "You've already done the hard part," he said. "This just makes sure no one can take it from you again." He hesitated, then added, "My mother's right about you. You don't need saving. But I'm glad I was here to witness it." Then he left, driving away down the road until the dust swallowed his car. Winter deepened. Snow came in slow flurries, settling on the fields like a promise. The girls spent their days inside, helping with chores, reading by the stove. Raina felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The fear of losing everything was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that what she had was real, unshakable. Sometimes she would take the deed from its folder and read her name aloud, not out of vanity, but disbelief. It wasn't about ownership, it was about belonging. Mabel received a letter not long after. Daniel wrote from his office, saying he missed the silence of home, that the city felt smaller now, somehow emptier. "You were right," he wrote. "Some truths aren't written in contracts." She read the letter to Raina by the fire, her eyes shining with pride. "He's changed," she said softly. "I think you reminded him what work with purpose looks like." Spring came again, gentle and golden. The soil thawed, the hens began laying, and the trees near the edge of the property blossomed in white. Raina stood one morning by the well, looking out over the fields that had once been nothing but dust. They stretched before her now in quiet, living color. The girls were playing by the barn, their laughter carried on the breeze. The hangar gleamed faintly in the sun, its rust replaced by patches of paint. Life, once fragile, had taken root. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Mabel came to sit with her on the porch. They didn't talk much. The air smelled of rain and new grass. In the distance, a tractor's hum drifted across the valley. Mabel watched the light fade and said, "You know, I used to think strength was about surviving what happens to us. But it's more than that. It's about choosing to keep building, even when no one believes you can." Raina nodded. "I used to think I needed someone to make things right. Now I know. Sometimes, you just have to make them with your own hands." They sat in silence after that, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the young wheat. When the first stars appeared, Raina stood, brushing the dust from her skirt. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "I'll plant another field." Mabel smiled. "And it'll grow, because it always does, for people like you." The night settled softly around them. Inside the house, the girls' laughter faded into sleep. Raina looked once more toward the fields and thought of everything that had been lost, and everything that had been rebuilt from those losses. The world had taken her land once, had tried to take her dignity too. But standing there beneath the wide sky, she realized something deeper. What is made with love, with sweat and stubborn hope, cannot be taken by force. It lives in the soil, in the walls, in the small hands of her children, in the quiet breath of a woman who refused to stop believing in life. And when morning came again, she woke before the light, as she always did, to meet another day on the land that finally and forever was hers. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more real stories. Keep watching, and share this video with someone who still believes in starting over.